So, the retailers may think Christmas is over, but it actually is not. There are 12 days in Christmas. We are right in the thick of it in the church calendar. And so we're going to grapple with that, kind of what's the now what? Heaven and earth have collided. Christ has come. So what does that look like? But to do it, let's get Christmassy. So don't put your ornaments away in your brain yet. Let's go back into Christmas. Some weeks ago, we had a chance to go as a family to the hotel lighting celebration. Santa Claus was there. So we all met Santa, which was great. And we all had a question for Santa. They were different. So Abby's question was, Santa, do you love Jesus? It's a great question. Not so crazy. Think about it. He is impersonating a saint on a holiday with Jesus' name smack dab in the middle of it. So actually, that's probably the most rational question you could ever ask a Santa impersonator. Santa, do you love Jesus? Daniel's question was far different. Hey, Santa, can I choose the music and the radio in the van from now on? I don't know what kind of power he thought Santa has, but that was his question. My question was, Santa, are you part of the IBRBS, which is a secret thing, which I'll let you know. So the IBRBS is the International Brotherhood of Real Bearded Santas. And that separates the top level kind of Santas. They're always in that. I have a friend who's an impersonator, so that's the group that pays dues, and it's like a union. And he's like, yeah? This is him. These are not our kids, but this is that Santa. Bruce, he's a real pro. So then I asked him a question, because I like nerding out on craft practice. I did a dissertation in craft learning. So I love any high-level practitioner of any craft. I like to know why they do, and what they learn. So I asked him, hey, Santa, what have you learned about kids over these many years he's been doing this? He's from, I think, Pueblo. There's a write-up in the paper about him. So, Bruce, what have you learned about kids by being a Santa Claus for so long? And he said this, in my experience, there's two kinds of kids that meet me for the first time. Because these are the little ones that first meet Santa Claus. Initially, there's going to be confusion because who is this big man in red and white? And then the kids will have one of two responses. Either they'll see this, be confused, but press into it, and they'll go up to me, just like that little boy, right? They'll go up to Santa Claus. They want Santa. Or they'll see Santa, be confused, and in some degree be afraid of Santa and move away from Santa. And it doesn't help to try to get them, because that'll only terrify them more. Come to me. Here's a candy cane. So those are the two kind of kids, and I think that's pretty helpful for us as we think about the confusion that we sometimes feel when we think about these bold, glittering promises of Christmas, which are peace on earth, goodwill toward man. These are pretty bold statements where a lot of times it seems like actually hate and evil are crushing to death hope and peace. So do these promises of Christmas ring true? That's what we're going to explore this morning. This is a big grown-up kind of sermon. This is because I knew most of you would be already Christians here. Last week was the seekers. This week are the disciples, and we want to grow you up. So we're going to look at what does it look like to have this mixed bag reality of life in a fallen world where hope and peace, light and darkness seem like they're colliding and slugging it out. And so we're going to study one of my favorite hymns. I've showed you this video before. It's Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, which was turned into a hymn. I've heard the bells on Christmas Day. Great song. But it helps to study some of the history of the song because it shows some of the tension of light and darkness working against each other. So let's watch this brief video and we'll talk about it.
I heard the bells on Christmas Day.
It was a long, cold winter in 1863. The Civil War between the states was raging mercilessly. Sons, fathers, and brothers from Mississippi to Maine had not come home for Christmas, and many would never return. Poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow sat in Cambridge, Massachusetts, pondering the state of the world around him. He had been widowed for the past 2 years since a tragic accident took his wife's life. His wife's dress accidentally caught on fire, and as Henry jolted up from his nap to try to extinguish the flames as best as he could, first with a rug, then with his own body, it was too late. She had suffered severe burns and would die later the next morning. Henry was left with dramatic facial burns and an unbearable grief. He grew a beard to hide his scars and often feared that he would be sent to an asylum on account of his sorrow. And now, his son Charles was seriously wounded from the war, having been shot by a Confederate bullet on December 1st. So as he sat, nursing his son on the long road to recovery, listening to the church bells pealing forth Christmas tidings, he struggled with the message of the angels proclaiming, "Peace on earth, goodwill towards men." Where was this peace? Where was God? The world with its injustice and war was seemingly mocking this statement. So he took up his pen and wrote the famous Christmas carol, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day," an honest look through the sorrow and the pain to the hope that God will prevail.
Many of the Christmas carols, if you study them, actually have a bunch of hidden tracks that never get sung because they're too dark and foreboding for Christmas. But actually, if they're not sung, you don't get the tension that they create because the light is invading the darkness. The darkness is threatened by the light and actually pushes back on that light. That's the true story. And so I'm going to read for you some of the hidden tracks from I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And again, remember, they help us as we enter into this tension because it feels like despair is oftentimes winning. Here's what it says. These are, I think, lines 5, 6, and 7. Then from each black accursed mouth the canyon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to man. So see those dark smoking cannons on the battlefield, taking life, taking life, taking life. That's what he's seeing. It was as if the earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said. For hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill toward man. So omitting these gritty verses is a disservice because, again, this poem helps draw out the real-life tension of light and darkness warring, and oftentimes it feels like the darkness wins, like this narrative we're about to read. Matthew chapter 2, we are still in Christmas. The Christ child has been born, but now what? Here's what it says. Now when the wise men had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise and take this child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child with his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So Jesus, just a toddler, he's already on the run for his life. That quote from Hosea the prophet, "Out of Egypt I call my son," it's a reference to the Hebrew slaves that fled from the grip of the killer Pharaoh. So this is purposely making a link, Matthew is doing here, to say that Jesus is a liberator like Moses, but better and more true. And just like the Pharaoh couldn't kill Moses, Herod can't kill Jesus. The salvation narrative will move forward, though these powerful rulers will savage the innocent. And they do. Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he gave orders to kill all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was filled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So that rather than create a fairy tale ending to the Christmas story, Matthew actually does, I think, a helpful thing to lament injustice that took place as a historical event. And he introduces to us somebody that the other Gospels don't, Herod the Great. Herod is a mixed bag of humanity. So he's both brilliant and super horrible. So for example, he was a skilled administrator and builder. He built things like massive aqueducts into the city that brought fresh and safe water there that saved many lives. He saved more lives than he killed. Most people don't think about that. But the things he built, sometimes, They were quite beneficial. They were part of common grace. He built amazing palaces. I've walked around like the Herodium, amazing structures. Or the temple in Jerusalem was one of the wonders of the ancient world. So he's brilliant and horrible at the same time. So he had a younger brother-in-law that was becoming too popular, so that guy had a drowning accident in a very shallow pool. He executed 3 of his sons because they had become too powerful and threatened his throne. And his boss, Caesar Augustus, Herod's boss, once quipped that it's safer to be a pig in Herod's household than one of his sons, which works on a bunch of levels if you think about pork. And so that was Herod, paranoid and brilliant at the same time, a real mixed bag character. And so that's the setting of this. This is the villain of the story. And if you read the text, you can see also this is a historical event that nobody really argues because it's really keeping in character with Herod's life and actions over a 40-year reign. So there's a good support that this did happen, this suffering in Bethlehem. And the massacre of the innocents is not something you want to Google because what it will bring up will bruise your heart. And what happened in Bethlehem, it's a hard thing to look at. And now, from childhood, as a boy, I heard all the Bible stories. I was super churched. And so when I heard the Bible stories, I always imagined that things in the Bible were bigger and larger and wider and further apart than they actually were. If you go to Israel, I've been there a couple of times, you'll see this, that things are smaller and closer, except for what Herod built. Like those aqueducts are amazing. They're huge. Or the Temple Mount is enormous. But everything else in the Bible, really small and really close together. Like Bethlehem's only 6 miles away from Jerusalem. It's real close. So when he dispatches his warriors to slaughter those children, it's quick. It happens that day. Also, Bethlehem's really tiny. It's a 1-hotel town, maybe 500 people. So when I read or heard the story about these children in Bethlehem, I always thought it was hundreds of kids. But it's a small group. It's maybe only 12 children. It's just the boys. There's a tiny, tiny group of people impacted by what Herod decreed. But it's helpful because it helps us wrap our minds around this. It's hard for us sometimes to get our sense of millions of people. Joseph Stalin, a Herod himself, was right when he said, when one person dies, it's a tragedy. When 1 million people die, it's a statistic. And that's largely true because it's hard for us to wrap our brains around millions and millions of people. But if you bring it and localize it down to just a dozen families touched by this horrific act, you're able to enter into that, and it tells you something. Let's assume that you're a parent in Bethlehem. Bethlehem's a small town. Like all small towns, everybody knows everybody. You know Joseph and Mary and this baby Jesus. Like, Joseph's a local handyman. They lived there for months, probably up to a year. He's a local handyman. Mary does all her laundry down by the stream, just like you do. Your toddler plays with Jesus at the park. That's a weird thought, huh? They're humans. So this is you. You're a parent of a toddler the same age as Jesus. And your child is clearly nothing like Jesus in the sense of there's no 2 children in a tiny town of Bethlehem that have ever had rough shepherds and royal court officials visit this child. So it's clear as day that your child is not Jesus. It's clear. So imagine how shocking it was to have armed men burst into your house. It's not him. But that life's taken anyway. So put yourself into the sandals of these people. They're real people. Think how confusing that would be, how unjust that would feel, that something that he did over here affects you. You have nothing to do with that. That seems so wrong, grossly unjust. And the thing about reading the Bible is, if you read it, it will give you a grown-up look at the reality of the world. It's both painful and hopeful at the same time. That's why we study the Bible. And we don't cut out the sections of the Bible to say, it's too uncomfortable. We're adults, so we can handle this and figure this out. And the truth is we need to, because there's thick lessons here if you don't look away at what took place there. Because we need to have a theodicy, an explanation for the problem of suffering in this world. If peace on earth, goodwill toward man was something that you knew because you lived in Bethlehem, like Jesus was born and everyone's talking about peace on earth, goodwill toward men, doesn't ring very true when you're burying a child. True? Don't look away. It really happened to real people. So how do we understand this? How do we understand the fact that heaven and earth are colliding, light and darkness, and it feels like oftentimes darkness wins? And the Bible gives us a grown-up understanding to look at this straight in the face without pretending that the darkness isn't. That's what it is. A bit of an announcement. So Michelle and I and the kids have been here about 7 years. We're about to take a sabbatical, so we're going to step away for about 7 weeks. And so this is the last time I'm going to preach for a couple of months almost. Generally, you don't maybe get this because you don't preach usually, but in preaching and vacations, you always want to leave on a high note. It's like the dessert. You want the dessert to be tasty and light, not rough vegetables. So when I was preparing this sermon, I was like, at the top of the page, in all caps I have it, blank page, I put, bring the joy. Because I wanted you to be, let's have, right? I want it to be high and light and fun. And sometimes that is the Bible. But as I read through the text, I'm like, well, this is not going to be what I want it to be. This is heavy. The Christmas story, if it's actually told, is quite heavy. Because there's a consequence when light breaks into the world to rescue a world that doesn't oftentimes want to be rescued. It forces a response. Just like with Santa Claus, you're going to move toward God and his goodness or away from God. There's nothing neutral in the Bible. And so I know this is not a goodbye for now, happy message. But we're not cherry picking through the New Testament and the book of Matthew. We're preaching through it. And it's written as a book. And this is the lesson it has for us. So let's do the work of actually plumbing through this scripture, looking to it again, and gaining all the insight we can about how is it possible that this world can be so horrible and so beautiful at the same time. So let's go back into it because we can learn. Let's do some work. You guys are ready to work. Let's reread this one part because I think Matthew does a tender thing in bringing to mind this reference to Ramah. He writes, a voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So Ramah means nothing to us, but to a Jewish audience, it's a real loaded term. In the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem. He broke down the walls, he sacked the temple, he burned most of the city, and he took thousands of people away to exile. He also killed a lot, doing a lot of war crimes, and he gathered them at Ramah, this place outside the city. So when Matthew drops down Ramah, in the mind of the readers, they're thinking of the exile in the 6th century, which was a horrible loss of life. But the truth is, it was a shared outcome. The people shared that outcome together, which is suffering, oftentimes. And if you read the history of it, there were people, really, they received this consequence from Nebuchadnezzar because the people had largely turned away from their God, right? Snubbed their nose at God. They began to worship the idols of the surrounding nations and sacrificing their own children to these cruel gods. And God gave many, many warnings over many, many decades, but they continued to snub them. So finally, he's like, here's my hedge of protection. That's gone. Nebuchadnezzar is coming now. But the thing is, when you read the story, you remember that there are people that didn't turn away from God, like righteous Daniel in the book of Daniel in the lion's den Daniel, and he suffered too, because he's part of the people, and our outcomes are shared. To understand suffering, we have to be reminded that God gives people real human agency to make choices, some of them very good, some of them very wicked, and other people are touched by those, and vice versa. So we've all done things that have helped people and also harmed them. And that's part of being a human community. God creates a collective, not island people. And our outcomes are shared, and some of those outcomes are suffering. So you will suffer sometimes based on what other people choose to do. And this text shows us that by saying, remember people like Daniel. They trusted God even though they received consequences that they didn't deserve. And that's going to be our reality sometimes, because we live in communities. And so we get that insight. Second, by linking Ramah and Bethlehem, Matthew's also leading to a conclusion about scale. So in this deportation, it's thousands of people that are taken away, people killed, and also people exiled. So it's a big scale consequence. It's a big scale suffering. And the whole Jewish royal family is taken away too. Big scale, big scale. But then it's linked to Bethlehem. Bethlehem's real small scale, only a dozen families involved in that, and none of them prominent. No royal family, it's just a bunch of farmers and shepherds It's pretty regular folk. But Matthew does a pretty powerful thing in linking those two things, the big thousands of people suffering, as well as just the dozens of family suffering. Because God cares about suffering for every individual, regardless of scale. He's not finite like us. Again, he doesn't have to think statistics or individual story. He can hold all those things in his mind together. He does that. And it matters. And the truth is, every injustice will be held accountable by the perfect judge. And really, and this might not be for most of you, but if you've been seriously harmed by the sin of somebody else, and that's some of your stories, I don't know you, but I know in the past, maybe you've been wounded or harmed. Those are real things. I haven't. And my life has been, lots of lollipops, but not everybody's life is that way. If you've been harmed by somebody else's sin that you held and felt as a shared outcome, really the only way out of that prison is to be able to release them into the perfect justice of God. That's really true. And the secular world has nothing for you with that. It doesn't. You experiencing grace is an overabundance that you can pour to other people. At the same time, holding this balance. I know this doesn't sound very American, but that God is a perfect judge. Everything will be held accountable. He sees everything. Small scale, big scale, he sees it all. He can deal with every case, and he will exact justice, if not in this life, in the next life. Everything's held accountable. Again, if you've suffered, really suffered, that means something to you. And it is your release, and God would have you be free from that bitterness. So those are a couple things we can take from this text when we study it again and not look away. The fact that there are shared outcomes of suffering because we have real human agency and we belong to each other. Also, God cares about suffering at every scale. And it matters, it's seen, it will be held accountable. Those are important, powerful things. Lastly, I think we can bring to this text a kind of humility and trust. In suffering, there's confusion. I don't understand, clearly do not understand, why sometimes God intervenes to thwart the wicked. And you read the Bible, sometimes he's like, no, you're not doing that, evil, horrible king or ruler. And sometimes he doesn't. And I don't know why. I can't tell why. But just like the confusion that can either move you toward God or away from God, I think it's better to move toward God with your confusion. Pray that through, talk it through. He's available. He knows the situation. I can't see what he's doing. He's working. He's always working, and no tears are wasted. God is working at a level we don't get. It's like when somebody's making a rug, you are only on the backside. It just looks like a bunch of disparate threads going nowhere. But he's working on the other side of the rug, and there's this pattern he's working. It will be beautiful, even though it seems at times so chaotic and that dark winds. It doesn't, but it can feel that way. So I think we can bring some trust and humility to the suffering that we experience. And wicked as the slaughter of the innocents is, it was foreseen. It will be accountable. And it's not for nothing, because even though there is a witness in those crushed lives, some of the witness of those crushed lives of those sweet children is that evil is real. Like Jesus came on purpose for a reason. He needed to come. Sin is real. Here's a part of the sermon that nobody likes to hear, but it should be heard, is that Herod was a horrible human, but he was a human. He was a mixed bag of humanity. And the seeds of his brokenness are inside of all of us. He just took it to a hyper level, but it's there in all of us. And it's easy for us to discount Herod as a supervillain and make ourselves feel better by comparing ourselves to Hitler and Herod. We're not supervillains, but that's really a disservice, because the reality is we're all sinners. We all have this brokenness, and most of us don't have the opportunity to go to the scale of a Herod, unchallenged authority. But if you think about yourself, we operate a good amount of the time out of fear, scarcity, pride. I do some incredibly petty things. Maybe I'm totally different than you. But I honor myself all the time. And if I could, I would be worshiped. I would totally be worshiped. I would be made much of. If I could control that, I would be made much of. And I think you're probably the same way. The seeds of Herod's brokenness, they're in all of us because we're all human and we're all fallen. That brings a little bit of humility to say, I guess Jesus really did need to come. Because left on our own, we're horrible and we're gifted. We do great things, we do evil things. And rather than, again, pretending that we don't and feeling better about ourselves by comparing ourselves to the lowest possible standard, we can actually look into what Scripture says and the tandem truths that somebody like the Apostle Paul can hold as we walk down a few steps on the Romans road. These things are at the same time true. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Everybody's in that same place. We all need a Savior. What makes sense out of Christ coming. And then at the same time, Romans 5:6. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, a good person. Though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So true. We don't deserve it. It's actually his grace that makes us ready to receive his grace. I mean, first of all, we acknowledge we're sinners, we need a Savior. But he is even the one that helps us acknowledge that. Awakens us to our own need so that we're not forever comparing ourselves downgraded, feeling better about ourselves. That's really how it works. Like, I'm not this person. Who cares? We've all fallen short of God's glory, what he made you for, the purpose, the worship, the joy, the thriving, all this stuff, the harmony, the shalom, everything he created us for, we just fall short of. And that's why he sent his son. And that's what we celebrate at the table, like we do. That's what communion is. Communion is a declaration. I am a sinner and I have a great, great Savior. And he is so awesome. And again, if in the confusion and suffering and sin, I would encourage you, move toward God, not away from God. Because what we proclaim at the table with those small elements is that Christ has already moved toward you. That's the message of the gospel. And he's amazing. We have a 2-year-old, his name is Vaughn. He makes some sounds that if you heard them, you would not understand what he's saying. And they sound exactly the same. Like his sound for, it's water, I got to take a pee, pick me up. But to his mother, she knows exactly what that cry means. And she comes to him. You have an amazing parent in God. And the proof is, he hears your cries. He knows exactly what you need more than you want, more than you know. That's why he came to die. And he's already moved toward you. So move toward him. And that's what we do at communion. We say, I'm yours. And I trust you, and what you did on the cross was work I needed for me to pay the sin debt I owe, in which I would never be acceptable to God, but now I am, and I can walk in holiness and newness of life, not discounting my sin, but actually looking it straight in the face and calling out for forgiveness. And God gives it. That's his promise. So communion is for Christians. If you're not a Christian, don't take it, or pray this prayer or the substance of it. That's what it means to cross the threshold from you as God to God as God, and you surrendered and hoping and trusting in him. So you can do that. I don't assume that everyone's done it and made that choice and laid down their yes to the forgiveness and leadership of God. But I love communion. It gives us a chance to make that fork in the road real clear. It's real clear. Nothing's neutral. This forces a response. Either you are yours, or you are God's. And then if you are God's,